Hello, my name is Thomas Heatherwick, and together with my studio team over the last 30 years, we've been working on projects in extraordinary different types of things, including Google's headquarters, where we made the entire roof generate its power, and in making cauldrons and bridges and buses, and along that way, there's been a sort of nagging thing that I spent a few years trying to reflect on and has grown into something that, I'm a partial introvert, so I don't really urge to stand here and talk to you all, but there's something that has kind of welled up as a bigger conversation that it feels that needs to happen in society. And so the heart of that, learnt while doing all these various different projects and thinking what was really driving us in our work was really the challenge of thinking about this experience that we all share in towns and cities all over the world, where we feel very powerless and we've been engulfed in an epidemic of characterlessness as cities grow and develop. And it sort of seemed like there is a profound problem in the construction industry, and trying to think, well, what's actually going on? And it seemed that an important thing to think about was what do buildings do for society? Because most people are not inside buildings. We spend so much time in the construction industry thinking about flow and daylight and spatial connections and construction techniques and structure and honesty and all of these things. But most people will not go inside your project. Most people are outside and are not invited into the wonderful, smashing, incredible new workspace that you've built. Even an art museum, only a certain percentage of people go inside them. But those same buildings are the walls of public life for everybody. And what do buildings give to that 14-year-old going past? When there's hundreds of times more people going past outside, have we really been thinking about what we give and the notion of being in public service? And have we been really thinking and using our imagination, not to just be, what's my imagination? Me and my ideas, I'm amazing and all my creativity, but to really imagine not what you think, but imagine how someone else feels about what you create. So that's imaginative skill, to put yourself in someone else's shoes, not your own, seems to be something really lacking. And there's a word that it felt that our world of building design and the construction industry had got hung up on words like beauty. And it felt that the problem with that is or quality, like good quality housing or good quality, it kind of means nothing. And so in the thinking that I was doing, I was trying to work with people to try and think, what's a word that is something we can all find more useful? And it's a disappointing word, actually. And it's the word boring. And it felt, yeah, that's subjective too. But when we did surveys, we found that about 90% of people all agree on what boring places are. And actually, I quite like ugly places. But you can have places that aren't boring. And so then you start going, whoa, what's the anatomy of boring? And so looking into that, it seemed, well, actually, we're talking about things that are too flat, too plain, too straight, too shiny, too monotonous, too anonymous, too serious. Like what's happened? And obviously sometimes it's right that a building needs to be serious, or a building needs to be plain, or anonymous, or flat, or shiny. But when you put them all together, pile them up again and again and again and again, there's something that became clear, that this is not a niceness conversation, that there is something, a notion of harmful boring. And it's a funny mix of words, but it became clear that this was a thing, and that this wasn't just us in our studio rattling thoughts around, that our researchers and the science, our ability to understand how our brains work is greater than ever, and how our bodies respond to places. And so we've been working in the last few years with some of the researchers and neuroscientists who are beginning to really think about this. And construction industry is a funny world, because it's defended itself by saying, I'm an art. If I'm an art, that's subjective, don't measure me. We measure all the other major industries on the planet. Oil and gas, how effective a dollar is in the world of oil and gas, or the financial industries. An industry just as big, the construction industry, we've not really been measuring relative to the biggest experiencers, which is all of us, in the walls of public life. And so, for example, a researcher like Colin Ellard in Canada, he's been doing studies in the UK, in Canada, and also in the US. This was one study in New York, on the same street, looking at buildings that were relatively plain, relatively flat, relatively anonymous, relatively serious, monotonous, and shiny, the building on the left, and then the building on the right on the same street, which is relatively less anonymous, less monotonous, less shiny, less flat. And the thing was, he's not been asking, him and his students haven't been asking people's opinions. They've been putting sensing technology on their body to just look at how does the body respond when in front, and spending time next to buildings with low visual complexity. And the results were quite astonishing, that the hormone level, the stress hormone of cortisol, was dramatically rising in the people in front of the relatively more flat, plain, anonymous, monotonous, serious buildings. And so that's felt quite powerful. And it just seemed very surprising that in the construction industry, people don't seem interested. Surely you want what you do to be liked by people, maybe even loved by people. And the interesting thing was then, looking at, there's a researcher at the University of Sussex who's been looking at babies. So, because you think, well, okay, what's the conditioning of adults? They may be conditioned, brought up with this, maybe that affects their brain. But when you look at 4-month-old babies, so they attached eye tracking software to be able to see where is the baby looking. And this is babies' looks when you give them boring and not so boring images to look at. I mean, it was pretty definitive. Look, why is the baby not looking at the one on the left? Going for the one with visual complexity, with fascination. So the question is that a luxury, or is it actually something essential for us? And this played out again and again with whichever study they did. And then separately, there's another researcher, for example, in Italy, looking at adults in exactly the same way, same results with a 4-month-old or adults. Now, at this point, you might be thinking, okay, this is all about niceness, but obviously the dimension in here, well, actually not obviously, is you might say, well, what is the connection to this pressing major issue in many people's minds, in many people's reasoning for being here today, with the climate crisis happening around us? Well, how this matters is as soon as you start looking at demolition. And because there's the creation time, but we have a demolition problem. And it's our dirty secret in the construction industry, which is that the average age of a commercial building in the UK is 40 years. So if I was a commercial building, I would have been destroyed 15 years ago. If I was a commercial building in South Korea, I would have been killed 25 years ago. Now, the point being here, our dirty secret in our industry is how much carbon is involved in that. So when you look at the carbon, this is a double-page spread from the book which came out from all of this research called Harmonise. Now, if we look at the amount of carbon, 4 kilos of carbon to make a Big Mac, to put a manned space rocket into orbit, it's 250 tons of carbon. Now, a British London tower, which in the big seats picture of things globally isn't that big a tower, which has an average life of 40 years, the amount of carbon, you see that bottom line, so that's 92,000 tons of carbon, which is the equivalent of 23 million Big Mac. And now imagine my little book that's this big when you open it up. That black line at the bottom is an extra 10 meters than my little book. So that's the equivalent of standing over there, smashing a hole through the wall there, and going through 2 more of auditorium spaces of this size, relative to the other ones. So it's something we should maybe think about. Now, one way that in talking about this we found useful is to think about the job that the outsides of buildings are doing. We have got interested in the world of food, in nutrition, and we are really thinking, are ultra-processed foods good for us? And people are really interested in complexity in the gut biome. But the connection feels like we now need to strengthen in the idea that we need the cities and towns and environments that surround us to be nutritious too. And that it's bad for our health to not surround ourselves in places that are good for our brain. And the heart of this is we've had, and I was brought up with this notion of form follows function, and it's wonderful and it feels great, and you're like, yes, that's what we do, and it feels pure, it feels powerful, but it feels like so often in the construction industry, we've forgotten that we've sort of celebrated and fetishized the idea of rationality and forgotten that it's rational to think about emotion, because how people experience what you do is a big part to do with their emotions. And there's been a huge gap in our emotional intelligence when it comes to property development, planning decisions, design decisions in the built environment of what we create around ourselves that are the walls of public life. And within this, we've had a catastrophe coming, which is, a friend of the studio wrote a book called The Lonely Century about how our digital devices are making us actually spend less time together. The algorithms that we thought would bring us together actually aren't. They divide us. And we don't need to go to a shop anymore because you can stay at home. You don't need to go to university at home because you can do a PhD lying in bed. So where do we see each other and the civility break out between us? It's in the streets. And we didn't need to design streets as social connectors in the past. They just were. And the scale of buildings was more human scale. But now a property development company won't bother making a 10-meter wide building. You only bother if you make a building that's 60 meters, 70 meters. You buy a whole lot of plots, you bring them together. Suddenly you get these big bummed buildings which become boring. And so in our work, we've been sort of using a technique which is to think about how someone feels from 3 distances. So one is how does what you're thinking about connect with the passerby when they're looking across the city from 100, 200 meters, maybe across roofs, from streets, looking in the distance. How does that make someone feel? The next one is street distance, which is when you're coming closer, when you're maybe 40, 50 meters away. What's the impact? How will somebody feel? But the cheapest, but also most impactful, is actually door distance. And that's what I believe as an industry we've been poorest at. And in society, we have the wrong conversation. We keep talking about how tall buildings are and whether we like big buildings or not. But I've experienced in places like Hong Kong, you can have tall buildings, but the bottoms can be human. It's not about height, it's about how generous something is to the street. Is it a giver or a taker? If you're a 14-year-old, what does it offer to you? Does it tell stories? Does it give you someone to sit? Would you go slower? Does it give you something to smile about or connect with someone? So the challenge now is how we can make new buildings or whatever we work on more public, more generous, more ornament, more detail, more stories, more humor, and more nature. And so I've got just 2 examples of projects in my own studio's work where we've been trying to implement these kind of notions. So one is a tiny building in Leeds at St James's Hospital. It's a Maggie's Cancer Care Centre, and we were given a site that was the last piece of green at the hospital. And we were told, put your building there. And in reality, that piece of site, and we were sort of romanticizing this piece of green land, was the leftover construction waste from building the car park next to it with a bit of turf on top. And so we were just there thinking, we can't be the ones to eliminate the last bit of green on the site, however weak that actually was. Could we make an excuse to make the site even greener by the action of building a cancer care centre? And so typically what would happen is that a big box sort of lands on the site. And so we tried to reel back to the spaces themselves. And these are non-clinical buildings, so there's a need for spaces where people can be very private. You're designing spaces that someone can cry in. And how do you make that feeling of holding people and intimacy and warmth, but also the ability to connect with other people who are going through a similar journey as you might be going through? So our logic was to break this down and not build a big building, and to take a series of more intimate spaces and then make social connecting spaces between them, and then grow those out to be planters. So in effect, the project is just 3 planters. And we could then have 300 different plant species and make something where the building was made a bit like those dinosaur models with slotting together plywood. So it's all breathable materials and lime mortar, and it's trying to blend indoor and outdoor. And this was the picture of it when it was finished. If you go back now, you would wonder where the building is. The afro, it's grown all over. Thank you. But it feels like the challenge is to put love into details, and that the details really do matter. I used to hate it when I was on my master's degree course, and the professor used to say, God is in the details. And I was thinking, no, he isn't. He's in the big picture. But it's big picture that drives the little details as well. And so the final thing I just thought I'd show is in Tokyo, where we had the chance to make a 14-acre district in the heart of Tokyo, right next to the Tokyo Tower. And this is a city that has hardly any parks. And there are a couple of really big ones, but there is very little green. And so in our minds, we're just thinking, how do we use the excuse of making 14 acres to make somewhere that is greener and softer? And we needed to build housing, shopping spaces, gallery spaces, working spaces. How do we make something that brings these together, but most of all, makes someone somewhere for, back to the 14-year-old. It's like, how do we make something for them? But we needed to make buildings. We weren't being asked to make park. And so thinking about that and how we could make something that could be buildable, affordable, pergola structures kind of came into our mind, really. The idea of a very simple grid that you could grow nature through, and just wondered, could we make a three-dimensional version of that? If we pushed and pulled that, could we turn that into a system that you could sort of clip and cut and push and pull and survive a 9-year design process through to construction? So this project, we finished it a year and a half ago, and it's called Azabudai Hills. And this allowed us to make something that could be both intimate as well as enlarged to the scale we need it to be in the different parts. But so it could relate to the small buildings to one side as well as swell up to the large scale for the larger buildings. And for example, here, there's a shrine on the left. So we could make the whole of it sort of rest down to the staircase to the shrine. We had 3 temples and a shrine on our site. But really the key for us was trying to get this intimate scale and get something, trying to find how we could connect with a visitor's emotion, because there are so few new places. Whenever anyone talks about a soulful piece of city, you always think it must be old. It's probably the old bit. So it's like a huge challenge. How the heck do we make new pieces of city which can have some emotional engagement with people and not just be cool in a postcard, but actually somewhere you want to investigate and explore? So we made it so you can walk up the buildings. So you can walk up, and on that architecture, we've got food growing, and we've got gathering spaces, and they have cookery classes. This is our commissioner, actually, when the project just opened. I know it looks like we just super glued some lemons onto a tree, but they were genuinely real fruit. But at the heart of this was thinking, how do you make a diet, almost like a menu of different places? You don't want just one thing. So, for example, this is the performance space, and even though we had to make incredibly strong structure for earthquake-proof, how could we use the steel to, a bit like quilling? There's a craft called quilling with tiny paper. Could we swirl the steel to make something that didn't look like it was designed to fight an earthquake? Then there was also a school for 1,000 children on the site, and we managed to get the factory that had made the original tiles for the post office that had been on the site and get their rejects and use that to make our school be able to be more affordable. And it has playgrounds on multiple levels. And to have play and children right in the heart of the city felt so important, right near the Tokyo Tower. But within this, I guess, psychological devices, like you feel different when you go through archways. And I was reading some of Christopher Alexander's work, and he's a very rare researcher who looked at the emotion around moves that you can make in architecture. So trying to think about when you arrive from the subway, what will entice you and make you feel invited into something? So this is where you arrive, just here, and the first thing you see is this net at the basement level inviting you through and up. And within it, we could, just like Japanese joinery, we had to make all these connections strong enough for earthquakes. Could we enjoy them and let them be things that could add fascination, add visual complexity, and something that you can engage with? But most of all, underneath everything, I believe that we are still all very tuned in to our child, our inner self, and that we don't enough make places for that person who's a middle-aged man, pseudo-child, but where places, because we all are silly underneath, and we don't make places for our humanity enough. So thank you very much, and good. Thank you.